Okay, and we're live with another episode of The Focal Thought. And my guest today is Angela Voss. How are you, Angela?
I'm fine, thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much for coming on the episode. I'm excited to speak with you. Just in terms of an introduction, you are a program director in myth, cosmology, and the sacred. You're involved with Renaissance and Baroque music. I believe, you do music performance studies at the City University in London. You've written a PhD on astrological music therapy of the Renaissance, Magus Marsilio Ficino, who I'm excited to talk to you about as well. It's through you that I found out about him and his work,
Okay, yeah,
which is exciting. You've taught, in Western esotericism at the University
yeah,
of Exeter, and you've also ran, the MA at the Cultural Study of Cosmology and Divination at the University of Kent. And
yeah.
as a fellow musician, that's exciting to hear that. So I wanted to start right away. So when someone talks about myth, cosmology, and the sacred, what sort of things are you getting to? If you could just speak to those three categories, please.
Yes. Well, when we were first thinking about what to call our MA programs, when we started at Kent in about 2006, um, we weren't then so involved in the fields of education or transformative learning. We were actually in religious studies department at the University of Kent. And we had to come up with a name that really covered the kind of breadth of knowing and ways of knowing that we wanted to bring into the academy, which involved not just scholarship in a traditional sense, but also bringing in imagination, intuition, sort of reflexivity, journal writing, creativity. Um, and at that time, we came up with the name of the cultural study of cosmology and divination because a large part of our work was centered on pre-modern cosmology, astrological practice, divination. Um, and then when we moved to the second university, Canterbury Christchurch, we decided to change it to myth, cosmology, and the sacred because really what we're doing is opening up a kind of mythopoeic vision. We're opening up the kind of mythic language and the truth that lies in myth and behind myth, but also very much to do with the human being's relationship with the cosmos. So not just astrological practice, although that comes into it, but a whole philosophy really about how we participate in a much bigger picture that involves the heavens, involves cosmic forces, involves symbolism to do with the heavens, which of course mythology is very much bound up with as well. And the sacred, well, everything we do is about opening up the sense of the sacred for people because we firmly believe that scholarship is a sacred activity, that anything that you devote yourself to, devote your heart and soul to, becomes a sacred activity for you, and that there's no reason why scholarship should be divorced from that. So all aspects of the sacred to do with religious experience, spiritual experience in all its various forms, paranormal experience, anything where that kind of mysterious other is glimpsed in one's life, um, comes really under the domain of sensing the sacred. So these three words, myth, cosmology, and the sacred, seem to sum up as best we could, the sort of vast terrain of material that we wanted to cover, and also people's individual personal experiences and their own spiritual paths that they could bring to their study. That's how it really came about.
No, that's great. And, the three are definitely related. They interact with each other. And I like that, you're taking the stance on sacred as a quality for, what you're,
Yes.
and, putting that quality on it really, changes the mood of how you're learning it and its output as well. It's sort of treated, in a sacred way, right?
Yes, I think so. I think the transformative aspect of what we've been doing has been very much to do with students discovering a kind of depth in themselves, which I guess one might call a sort of sacred path or or writing about areas of the sacred, aspects of the sacred in their own practices. Yes, I suppose everything sort of comes under an umbrella of an overarching worldview where we are all participating in something much greater than ourselves, and that is a sense of the sacred. So when we're studying sacred traditions, esoteric traditions, spiritual traditions, texts, practices, rituals, we are at the same time lifting our soul to a certain extent, as we study this material, because this material was designed to kind of raise people's consciousnesses to an understanding that there's another part of ourselves apart from our rational minds. So yes, it all becomes bound up together, definitely.
And that's where the transformation happens when you speak of transformative learning, right?
Yes, well, of course, there are many forms of transformative learning, and there's a sort of traditional form which is very much to do with social transformation and sort of reformation. But we've sort of found our way into transformative learning through a kind of Jungian approach of various writers, which is already quite well established in education, where transformation happens because students are kind of beginning to reveal the unconscious dimension of themselves, if you like, through doing this work. And the ultimate goal is some kind of inner integration or inner marriage of heart and mind. So, yes, it's a sort of transformative process of integrating inner and outer worlds. And that's why we've introduced aspects like a creative project and a personal journal into the program, so that both the kind of conventional essay writing, if you like, and the dissertation writing happens with a very personal account of the journey as well. Yeah, that's the transformative part. And many students have they've been bold enough really to take on quite deep personal material and work with it in a mythic way or an archetypal way, and come out really with new insights and quite changed. So it's been very groundbreaking. But I should just point out that this program is actually ending this year. So yeah, the university in their wisdom no longer wish to continue it. So it's unfortunately, yeah, it's coming to an end.
Oh, that's too bad. But I'm sure for, the time that you've spent with it and, the students that have, learned the information from it has been transformative, right, to both you and the students. And hopefully they pass it on to friends and into culture. It'll have
Oh,
some
well,
sort of
definitely.
effect.
Yes. And we've got a vast community now of followers. And now we've gone online with a new project, the Myth, Cosmology and the Sacred Centre, which we developed during lockdown, which is really taking off and going global. So we are carrying on the work with our independent centre now, which is really exciting.
Well, that's great. And I really like that you use the term transformative learning. From reading some learning and behavioral books, people argue about the definition of learning, or rather they debate it. And, some say that when you learn something, the duration is not important, So if you've learned something and if you remember it for, 3 minutes, that's okay, you've learned it. But I personally like to think that if you've learned something, if you've really studied it, like you say, when you go deep into it, you actually transform from it. You've become the knowledge, and it becomes a part of you, because that has so much better meaning to it.
Definitely. And I think it was Plato who said that, when you really understand something, it's like a kind of spark that arises between you and the text. It's just kind of, there's sort of inner tasting, there's a sort of inner knowing, and you kind of get it and you feel it and you've internalized it. And I think we all know when we come across writers or books where, the author does that for us, and we suddenly wake up, we read a passage, we think, wow, yes, that really, really means something to me. And we also know, the vast majority of academic texts which turn us completely off because the author doesn't appear to want to be involved at all in what they're writing about, and therefore how can they involve us? So yeah, I think it's this personal connection with the text and the writer that sparks a kind of inner understanding. I like the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi's word of tasting, that you sort of taste something which is meaningful to you, and that really fires your desire to want to pursue it and learn more.
Sure.
And changes you.
There can also be different levels of learning. Like you can read something like, say, in a Reader's Digest, and it's very entertaining and it's very light reading, and you might not pay any attention to it after that. But then you might see something that, like you're saying, you're in awe of, and you grab it, and it changes the trajectory of your life, right?
Yeah. Well, yes, of course, so many different kinds of reading, but I think I tend to take quite a sort of divinatory attitude towards all of this. I think the Reader's Digest or whatever it is, a newspaper you happen to pick up, you can come across anything that could suddenly move you. If you're in a kind of state of mind that's looking for a sign, or, just it's surprising where you might find something which is going to just answer that inner question you had, or, throw light on something you were confused about. It can happen anywhere at any time.
No,
If
that's
you're
very true. Yeah,
open
it
to
could
it.
be in a passing joke or a comment. That's very true.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you speak of myth now, myth is this word where, for me personally, what I've read about myth, it has to do with, stories of old, traditions and things that, have shaped your worldview.
Yeah.
It's got a connotation that, something is not true, even though it might not factually have happened, but then the essence of the story is true. So maybe if you could just, speak a bit about myth and what it means to you.
Well, I think that's a very unfortunate modern sort of post-Enlightenment understanding that myth means something untrue, because it's only untrue from the point of view of, what neuroscientists might say a left hemisphere rational analytic mind. It's perfectly, absolutely true from the point of view of a very sort of deep imaginative engagement with the nature of the world that's more poetic. You don't ask if a poem is true or not. You sense a truth in it for you, which has nothing whatsoever to do with the kind of truth or knowledge that the rational mind would judge by. So I think myth is that. Myth is a way of accessing a kind of truth that goes beyond the rational and profound truth. We in our program we would always start off with the myths that Plato uses, for example, which he calls likely stories. And whenever he reaches a point in his dialogues where he wants to try and convey some kind of truth about the human condition or the world or nature or the cosmos that goes beyond what we can scientifically or rationally deduct about it, he moves into myth. He moves into a sort of mythopoeic language, because that's the only kind of language where one can actually kind of meet the place where you participate in a much bigger whole. We're talking about these sort of two parts of the human being again, that we have a whole dimension of knowing, a sort of sixth sense knowing, a sense of this connection with something bigger, which is always conveyed through myth. And I think it was Ursula Le Guin who said, when the true myth rises into consciousness, then you have to change your life. And we're surrounded by so many false myths. We're surrounded by so many, fake news, false myths, stories that we're led to believe that aren't true at all, very much on a surface level. But if you go deep into the ancient myths in Plato, the ancient Greek myths of ancient cultures, you find a truth, an archetypal truth about the human condition, I think, and you can connect with that. And it's certainly a truth that goes a lot deeper than the other side of our brains that just wants to rationalize everything or, make it historically true. It's talking in metaphor, and myths talk in metaphor and symbolic language. And that language goes far deeper than our language of rationality.
Sure. And I like that you say that, we're always trying to rationalize things first on the surface level, rather than look at the root story, that is the true lesson behind it. And the same could be said of if you, went from the future to the past and you told people about, say quantum physics and, the things you can see beneath the layers, they would attribute that to myth, right? Even though it's true in our time, as we found out.
Yes, well, that's quite a kind of hypothetical thing to try and imagine what they would have thought of quantum physics. But I think there is a kind of there's now becoming more of an overlap between science and mystical approaches, if you like. I mean, there's a whole discipline of new scientific thinking which is trying to grasp, our part in this, in the bigger picture, without reducing it to sort of materialist explanations. And yeah, I think there's definitely a move towards a more holistic view of science.
What I mean by that also is that if we try to explain the world to someone, they might take it as myth because it's so fantastic that,
Well, how can you explain the world without myth, in a way? I think it's quite interesting that even astronomy, takes mythic images in order to, its images of its black holes and its green giants and its, these beautiful kind of poetic images it has in the sky. I think when we're faced with the awe and wonder, of what is totally beyond our comprehension, we have to just go into mythic language. We have no other way, really, of beginning to understand it, unless we reduce it back down, back to our materialist viewpoints, and then we don't grow or expand or move into it. I mean, we're very, very influenced and interested in Ian McGilchrist's work. He wrote an amazing book called The Master and His Emissary, which is all about these two different modes of knowing we have within ourselves. The master being our sort of right hemisphere way of knowing, and the emissary, the left, and that this bigger picture, this deeper knowing, this participative knowing, this deep intuitive knowing, which has come up through esoteric traditions, is what the right hemisphere does and is very good at, and is very good at grasping, and the left hemisphere, which is very good at rational analysis and details and analyzing things and conceptualizing things, rightfully speaking, is the master of is the emissary of the master of the right hemisphere. And we've got it the other way around now, and our rational mind has become totally dominant. So I suppose part of the projects we've been doing is in aid of trying to rebalance the way we think and understand towards strengthening what we might call right hemisphere knowing, the bigger picture.
Got it. So we should really be using, both hemispheres of our brain and, put our faith in myth, right?
Well, yes, we should definitely be using both hemispheres of our brain, but in the sort of appropriate kind of way, so that true myth doesn't get relegated to just mere falsehood or story. As you say, it opens us out into deeper truths. And then we know how to sort of move back and forth between these different ways of knowing, and we don't let our rational minds have the final word and the final say, which of course they do in our society all the time.
Sure.
So of course that's why the arts and humanities are so important to begin to open up this other way of knowing.
It's very important. I always think that science starts with art, even though the two are integrated and related. But art is sort of, that imagination, it's the spark, it's the starting point. Then science just validates it, right?
Absolutely. The imagination is everything, really, which again, people don't really understand, or they just regard it as a sort of fantasy. And the whole esoteric traditions and philosophy would insist, would tell us that the imagination actually is what links us to this bigger picture. The imagination is what links us to spiritual knowing. And of course, there is a kind of just a fantasy that just sort of, plays around, as it were, with the images in our sense perceptible reality. But there's this whole other kind of imagination, like the divine imagination, the romantic poets, that does lead one a lot further.
Sure. And then when you speak of cosmology, do you speak of astrology, Vedic astrology, Western astrology, things like that?
Um, yes, well, there are two aspects to cosmology, really. I mean, there is actually astrology, and myself and my colleagues are astrologers. I've been practicing astrology for many years. So there's the actual technique of using planets as symbols to reveal um, a kind of deeper kind of knowing, reveal intuitive knowing. And there's the other sense of cosmology in that it's well, I'm just thinking, the pre-modern cosmos was understood as a very ordered metaphor or symbol of how the soul situates itself in the world. So, it was understood that the soul would sort of travel up through the planetary spheres after death, or even in this lifetime in visionary experiences, and travel down again. There was a sort of planetary ladder, as it were, that led up to God. In pre-modern cosmology, it was understood as a beautiful sort of metaphor for sort of developing different aspects of the soul. And of course, the whole kind of movements of the planets, each having their different cycles, different timings, doing things in relation to the cycles of the planets, like agriculture, everything really, paying attention to where the moon is all the time, really living one's life in harmony with what the symbolism of where the planets are at any particular time. There's a whole sort of cosmological framework that people lived by, in pre-modern times, and we've become cut off from now, and astrology is now just tends to be relegated as some kind of superstitious activity, instead of seeing it as kind of reconnecting oneself with this bigger picture.
Sure. And I have read that, even something, as basic as human development, we're born as an infant and then we develop, our awareness, 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, etc. That's to do with the rotation, I believe, around the planets, right? Like going up the
well, yes, I mean, once you start going into this deeply, you begin to sort of realize how all the planetary cycles have sort of nodal points that relate to different life periods. And you can see it very clearly with the planet Saturn, for example, which has a 7-year cycle, 28-year cycles, so 7-year quarter cycles, ages of 7, 14, 21, 28, and so on, are always very key times for kind of getting to grips with the world in one way or another. And the same for all of the planets, of course. So, yes, I mean, once you start really entering into that world, it all begins to open out for you, and you begin to sort of see symbolically, how your life has resonances, with these archetypal meanings, which is not to say that the planets literally, send out influences or effects. And this has been a great kind of mistaken view of astrology, that it's somehow about planets predicting people's futures. It's not that at all. That's how it kind of got muddled up with sort of Aristotelian thought about sort of the mechanisms of planetary motion and time. But it's more that the planets are, I mean, just like tea leaves or tarot cards, they are there as symbols to awaken our imaginations, and somehow reveal something about how everything is connected together. And I would certainly never ever practice it in a predictive kind of way, because I think it's, and this is, what someone like Ficino in the 15th century sort of started, really, this new way of thinking of astrology, far more humanistically and psychologically, that it's about delving deep into oneself to understand one's own destiny and why one is here, and what one's calling is, and why we have this short life and what we're to do with it in the best possible way. So self-empowering, really.
Sure. And I firmly do believe there is a connection with the planets, just like the sun affects us. I'm sure, the planets,
yes,
their rotation is definitely affecting us. And some
yes.
people, like you're saying, have exaggerated the meaning of that connection, right?
I think it's exaggerated. I think the problem is taking it too literally. either too literally and too fixedly, rather than going with just the fluidity of the symbolism. And I think we've, as Jung kind of lamented, we've lost the ability to have a symbolic attitude, to actually kind of see how one thing points to another thing, that opens up meaning, rather than just some kind of actual literal fact. And once you start opening up meaning, it all becomes very, very sort of fluid and continually developing and continually negotiating, continually evolving. It's not just a kind of a literal meaning that's an end in itself. So opening up a symbolic attitude when one is doing divinatory practices means that it's like unpeeling levels of an onion. You can start moving to very deep places, and then all sorts of interesting, exciting things happen, like synchronicities and magical moments and things that seem extraordinary, and life becomes a lot more exciting.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I like that you say evolving, because the connection that we have now, planets, the orbit with the Big Bang, everything is moving and contracting and evolving. That connection can dynamically change as well.
Yeah, of course. Of course, yes.
I wanted to highlight, keeping with astrology and using it as a bridge to Marsilio Ficino. I almost think you're the second Renaissance for bringing him about. And, I didn't know about him, honestly, till, I was looking at some of your work. And this is a person I know you've studied extensively. You've written a book about him, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And he's, if I can just, for the listeners, sort of give the backdrop, he sort of is considered, I think, the center point for triggering the Italian Renaissance by translating a lot of Plato's works from Greek to Latin.
Yeah.
And I think he was a doctor before and ended up becoming a priest. And then he got into astrology, and there was a situation where, the church investigated him, because of his astrology. And this is a very, significant person, because that point from the medieval ages to the Renaissance, he was that bridge and that trigger. Yeah. So I know we could do a whole episode about him, but if you could just speak briefly on him and why he's so important and what he means to you.
Yeah, well, I think, it's funny when you're sort of grabbed by someone from the past. And that happened to me in my 20s when I discovered his letters. He's written hundreds and hundreds of letters which have been published, and realized what an incredibly wise man he was. And that he practiced astrology. He was a Christian priest. He practiced a form of astrological music therapy, which really, really interested me, and I ended up writing a lot about it. Very modern in many ways with his holistic sort of practices. He was given the task by Cosimo de' Medici, who was the ruler of Florence, to translate the entire works of Plato into Latin from Greek, that had never happened before, and that really instigated the huge sort of humanist Platonic revival in the 15th century, which led to the Renaissance. He wrote his own original work called the Platonic Theology, which was a way of trying to bring together Christianity and Platonism, and that was his main life task, to try and show that Platonism and Christianity were not opposed, but were actually could mutually inform each other, and that this mixture of philosophy and faith was required, in order for human beings to kind of really move on in their consciousness. So he was also about, bringing these opposites together, and that's, I think, what really, really, really fascinated me and drew me in, was that his work was exactly what I wanted to do, and particularly his reinterpretation or understanding astrology as a part of a personal development program, if you like, but which also was intensely spiritual and was about aligning oneself with the planets in order to eventually align oneself with what lay beyond the planets, which was God, or the One, or the Supreme Being. So his astrology was in aid of his Christian Platonism. And when I first started working on him back in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, no scholars really could understand that, because astrology was very much a taboo subject within the academy. So he was revered as a great philosopher, but they couldn't really understand how he could also practice astrology. So I felt almost as if he was tapping me on the shoulder and saying, look, you've got to show them how astrology was absolutely integral to Platonism. And I just felt I had sort of no choice but to do this. It was quite a strange relationship, really, with him for many, many years. And I wrote a PhD on his astrology and his music therapy. And it was quite hard because, of course, he was part of a totally male milieu. He was part of a group that was sort of recreating the Platonic Academy of Athens, all men, and all his letters were addressed to men. His entire circle was male. And I found it quite challenging to, have to enter this male circle as a woman and get to know them all, and sort of write about all the ideas. But very, very inspiring too, because the wisdom that comes through his writing is extraordinary, and it's universal, and it's for all time, and it's very integrated. And he's one of these people who could stand beyond dualisms and beyond division and find a way of writing that could lead somebody to that kind of third place of resolution. So even though he was struggling with the church at the time, who couldn't understand, how he could be practicing astrology and such like and magic, he was somehow always able to write in such a way that didn't offend them, and to show that he could see the unity beyond the division. He could see how, when Plato talked about the daimones or the spirits or certain pagan ideas, that these are actually part of a much bigger unity or oneness that in a Christian sense could be called God. So he was finding ways all the time to try and understand how there's a kind of universal religious sense and understanding that these different traditions were expressing in their particular ways, and that they were not at odds, and shouldn't be regarded as opposed to each other. So his work was of a syncretist, and he was definitely trying to bring these opposites together, both in himself, which he could see in his own horoscope, and in the world. And I just, was absolutely fascinated by him, and spent many years of my life writing a lot about him, and also making a CD called Secrets of the Heavens, which was like a sort of recreation of his singing, or his Orphic singing, which was a wonderful thing to do. And we performed these Orphic hymns, which are hymns to the planetary gods that he would perform as part of his natural magic. He performed them in an ancient church in London, and I really felt that was he would have been proud of that.
That's awesome.
Bringing those two worlds together. Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that. And it's important because, people don't know that, I guess, Plato didn't write any of his stuff down, and it was his students who, took it, and then, Plotinus and, a lot of them later on started to write it down. And then I think Ficino actually translated his works, literally, but then he also had his take on his works, and, like you're saying, combined it with astrology. So, one could spend a lifetime or more on someone who achieved so much in his one lifetime. So I'm really glad that you took him on, and like you're saying, his philosophy is universal, and it's relevant even in these times today.
Yes, I mean, I took on one aspect of him, I have to say. I sort of took on his whole astrological music. I certainly would not say that, I mean, there are some very, very great scholars of the Renaissance, like Michael Allen and Buddha Hanegraaff and other sort of historians of Western esotericism, who have taken on far more of his sort of theology and philosophy and really grappled with it. I really have to say that I haven't done that. I've really focused far more on the sort of Platonic nature of his thinking, and how he worked with the sort of symbolic metaphor and the imagination, within his natural magic. I mean, that's really been my way into him, into his work.
Sure. And you've done it in two languages. You've done it in English with writing and with music as well, which is the second language. So that's great.
Yes, I mean, not anymore. I don't really play music anymore, but yes, the actual project of sort of semi-improvising these hymns that he translated from Greek to Latin as well, these Orphic hymns, and actually performing them was definitely a massive sort of highlight of my life. And I think, I mean, a lot of people have found that it just brings to life, something of the magic of what he did, because his magical rituals to invoke the planetary spirits, which would then help the human soul kind of rise up through the cosmos, as it were, and become like the kind of spiritual beings, was performed within ritual contexts, that involved all sorts of different plants, herbs, crystals, images, and music, and must have been quite extraordinary.
No, and all of that, leads to myth, cosmology, and the sacred. so that's
well, great. It's absolute embodiment of it all. Yes, absolutely.
No, that's great. Angela, thank you very much for coming on the episode. It's been great having you, and also just with the work that you do, and just treating it sacred, like you say, and encompassing things that we tend to rationalize with the left brain that we should use at times, but then we should always try to use our right brain for these purposes, because we'll definitely find a closer rendition to the truth and meaning for ourselves. So once again, I thank you for that, and thank you for the work that you do, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
Okay. Thanks. Have a good day.